Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the rolling hills of Appalachia, where the fog clings to the earth like a shroud, there exists a place few dare to speak of, a hollow that time has nearly erased, yet its scars remain etched into the very soil. The people born there were not like others. Their faces bore the marks of bloodlines too closely bound. Their eyes carried the weight of secrets whispered behind locked doors. They were children who never had a choice, born into a cycle they could neither escape nor understand. For generations, their lives were hidden from the world, tucked away in the mountains, where the sound of their cries never reached beyond the trees. This is not just the story of a family. It is the story of a place where nature and nurture collapsed into something darker, something America has tried to bury. This is the forgotten hollow, where the most inbred children in America once drew their first breath. The truth begins not in hospitals or churches, but in cabins built from rotting timber, standing crooked against the earth. Inside, families lived together in ways that blurred the lines of morality and survival. A brother was not only a brother, a father could also be an uncle, a mother might be both sister and grandmother. Each new birth carried with it not just a child, but another knot in a twisted web that grew tighter with every generation. What outsiders called grotesque, those inside called tradition. It wasn't spoken of with pride, nor with shame. It simply was. In their eyes, blood was all they had, and so they clung to it, even as it poisoned them from within. To find this hollow, you'd need more than a map. You'd need silence. A silence thick enough to hear the crack of branches as you enter a land that feels untouched by progress. A silence so heavy you'd swear the trees themselves are holding their breath. Locals know the stories, but they rarely speak them aloud. They'll tell you that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the faint echoes of children's laughter drifting through the woods. But it's not the laughter of innocence. It's laughter with something missing, laughter that feels wrong, the kind that makes your stomach turn without knowing why. And yet, for those born there, this hollow was not a nightmare, it was home. They knew no other way of living, no other truth, but the one written in their family's blood. They did not realize that the world beyond the mountains looked at them with horror, or that they were walking reminders of a lineage corrupted by isolation. The forgotten hollow was not always a place of silence. Once it pulsed with life, though a life few outsiders would recognize. Families built their existence in the shadows of the mountains, relying on hunting, trapping, and small gardens carved from unforgiving soil. Poverty clung to them like a second skin, and with it came desperation. Roads rarely reached their homes, schools were distant luxuries, and churches, when they appeared, were often abandoned after a single season. In this isolation, rules dissolved. There was no law to govern the bonds they formed, only blood, and blood became both salvation and curse. Inbreeding was not spoken as a word, not defined as a concept. It was simply a cycle, like the seasons that passed. A daughter would grow into a mother without ever leaving the walls of her childhood cabin. A son would father children who were also his nieces. Generation after generation, the line folded back upon itself until the branches of their family tree resembled not a tree at all, but a circle, closed and unbroken. Each child born carried subtle reminders of what had been done. Eyes that did not align, jaws that struggled to form words, minds that never fully matured. Yet within their own world, these differences were not strange. They were shared, they were familiar. Occasionally, outsiders stumbled into the hollow. Hunters, travelers, missionaries, or surveyors who wandered too far from the main roads. What they found left them shaken. They would describe faces that seemed uncanny, voices that sounded distant, movements that felt unnatural. But most disturbing of all was the way the people watched them, eyes both vacant and sharp, as if measuring whether the stranger was a threat or a gift. Rarely did these outsiders stay. They left quickly, carrying with them stories too bizarre to believe and too unsettling to forget. Whispers of these encounters spread through nearby towns, feeding local legends. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the hills, lest they come across the hollow folk. The fear was not only of being harmed, it was the fear of seeing something they couldn't unsee, of confronting the proof that such lives existed within their own country. And so, the hollow remained isolated, a living secret, buried not by distance, but by silence. Inside the hollow, the children grew with no sense of their difference. To them, the world was whole within the boundaries of their land. It was only when eyes from beyond the trees looked upon them that the truth revealed itself, like a wound too deep to close. The children born in the hollow carried their history not in books, not in memories, but in their very bodies. Every feature was a signature of the past. Some had eyes that never looked in the same direction, gazes forever fractured. Others bore lips and jaws malformed, speech reduced to murmurs and broken sounds. Many moved with a stiffness, their limbs bent by bone that had not grown as nature intended. Their laughter, when it came, was high and thin, echoing unnaturally through the trees. These were not simply defects, they were the visible imprints of bloodlines that had nowhere else to go. For the families themselves, these marks were unremarkable. They did not see tragedy where the outside world saw deformity. A child born unable to speak was still a child, another body to keep the fire alive through winter nights. A son who struggled to walk could still carry water from the stream. Their value was measured in survival, not in what the world beyond demanded of them. Yet to those few who witnessed them, the image never left. Journalists, decades later, would recall the hollow's children as both haunting and heartbreaking, existing in a state between humanity as it should be and something more fragile, more broken. What made the hollow terrifying to outsiders was not violence or cruelty, but the way innocence itself had been reshaped by isolation. A little girl might look at you with a smile so wide it seemed out of place, her eyes not following yours, her voice trembling on half-formed words. A boy might trail after you through the woods, his movements uneven, his laughter hollow, as though mimicking sounds he had never fully understood. There was no malice in them, but their presence left visitors unsettled in ways they struggled to put into words. It was not evil that lived there. It was something more difficult to face. The outcome of neglect, of abandonment, of a society that had allowed its people to vanish into the cracks of the map. The most disturbing truth is that many of these children never knew their own fathers' true names. Fathers and brothers blurred into one, uncles and cousins became the same. Blood was shared until it was indistinguishable. They did not ask where they came from, because in their hollow there was nowhere else to come from. They were not the product of a single act, but of generations, each one folding back into itself until the family line resembled a mirror reflecting endlessly inward. By the early 20th century, word of the hollow began to seep beyond the hills, carried by rumor, then by whispers in newspapers that dared to publish fragments of the truth. Journalists described what they called degenerate families, though their words were laced with both fascination and revulsion. Photographers occasionally slipped into the hollow, capturing images that seemed more like relics of another world than portraits of modern Americans. The faces they revealed shocked the public. Sunken eyes, twisted features, bodies that seemed both frail and uncanny. To the wider world, these people became symbols of rural decay, of the dangers of unchecked isolation. But to the families themselves, it was simply their reality, exposed like a wound under the flash of a camera. The state took notice in scattered bursts, often too late or too clumsily to change the course of fate. Social workers ventured into the hollow, sometimes removing children, sometimes turning away in horror. Yet intervention rarely lasted. Poverty was a shield as much as it was a curse, and the government was hesitant to spend resources on communities so far removed from mainstream society. The hollow slipped back into darkness each time, its children continuing to be born in silence. What haunted the few who entered was not just what they saw, but what they felt. One missionary described the hollow as a place where time does not move. Inside, the cabin seemed frozen, the air stale, the eyes of the children locked in expressions that never fully changed. There was no sense of progress, no sense of escape, only the weight of repetition. A family line circling itself, unable to break free. He left after only 2 days, never to return, admitting in his journal that he feared for the soul of the land itself. By then, the hollow had become a secret known by nearby towns but rarely acknowledged. Aloud, locals described it as cursed, a place one avoided even in daylight. Children dared each other to wander close, but adults kept their distance, afraid of what they might see, or worse, what they might be forced to admit about the neglect festering in their own state. Because to acknowledge the hollow was to confront a truth America wished to deny, that its most horrifying failures were not in foreign lands or ancient times, but hidden within its own borders, born from its own indifference. If you stood in that hollow today, you might see nothing but trees reclaiming the land, cabins collapsed into the earth, traces of fire pits buried beneath moss. Time has done its work to erase the evidence, but the soil remembers, and so do the stories. Descendants still walk among us, scattered across nearby towns, carrying in their blood the silent memory of what happened there. Some bear the marks clearly, while others pass unnoticed, their lineage diluted over time. But the legacy of the hollow lingers like a shadow, not fully gone, not fully alive. The greatest horror of this place is not only in the deformities or the photographs that survive, but in the fact that it was allowed to happen at all. These were American children, citizens born under the same flag, abandoned by the very society meant to protect them. While progress marched forward in cities and towns, while technology reshaped the modern world, here in the hollow, lives were left to decay in a cycle of desperation and neglect. Their fate was not chosen by them, but written for them before birth, carved into their very bones. And yet, despite the haunting nature of their existence, they were not monsters. They were children who played with sticks in the dirt, who laughed when fires crackled, who clung to their mothers for warmth in the winter. To look at them and see only horror is to miss the deeper tragedy. That innocence itself was warped by circumstance, that their humanity was trapped in a cage built of blood and silence. That is what unsettles the most, the reminder that cruelty does not always come from violence, but from absence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run from it, hidden it, or carried it forward in silence? The hollow forces us to ask questions most would rather nor. How much of who we are is written in our blood? How much is shaped by the choices of those who came before us? And when the two collide, when blood and history bind us in ways we cannot escape, what becomes of identity itself? For the children of the hollow, the answer was never given. They lived and died within the same circle, and their voices, fragile and fractured, faded into the woods long before anyone thought to listen. There are those who say the hollow was cursed, but curses do not appear without cause. What grew there was not magic or myth. It was the slow consequence of abandonment. Families cut off from education, from medicine, from connection to the outside world. Generations trapped in poverty, with no roads leading in and no roads leading out. In that isolation, survival became its own twisted creed, and blood became the only currency left to spend. The children born of those choices were not evidence of evil. They were the mirror of a nation that looked away. America has always had places it would rather forget. Reservations pushed to the edge of maps, asylums where the unwanted were locked away, towns swallowed by rivers when dams were built. The hollow belongs to that same history, one of the shadows where the story does not fit the patriotic songs or the shining monuments. It is a reminder that progress is selective and that those who fall outside its reach are left to rot unseen. In that sense, the hollow is not just a physical place, it is a wound, and it belongs to all of us. The children of the hollow are gone now, their cabins collapsed, their bloodlines thinned and dispersed. But the photographs remain, the stories remain, and the silence remains. When you look at their faces, you are not just seeing genetic deformities, you are seeing generations of neglect sealed into human form. You are seeing the cost of turning away, the cost of letting people vanish into the margins until they no longer resemble what we recognize as ourselves. That is why their memory unsettles us, not because they were different, but because they reveal what difference looks like when society abandons its own. Standing in the hollow today, the quiet is heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin. It feels less like a place and more like an echo, a memory that refuses to fade. To walk there is to walk among ghosts, not of individuals, but of a cycle that repeated too long. Ghosts that whisper a question America still cannot answer: what happens to the forgotten, and who bears the blame when innocence is twisted by neglect into something unrecognizable? Some say the hollow is finally gone, swallowed whole by the forest, erased by time. But erasure is a lie. You cannot bury what has already been written into the earth. The stories of the hollow persist because they force us to face truths most would rather leave hidden. They remind us that horror is not confined to the pages of Gothic novels or the screens of horror films. It can grow in silence, in poverty, in the dark spaces where no one dares to look. The children of the hollow were never given the chance to define themselves. Their lives were told through the words of outsiders, journalists, photographers, missionaries, who painted them as curiosities, as warnings, as monsters. Rarely were they seen as what they truly were, victims of circumstance, born into a story already poisoned before they could speak their first word. Their memory unsettles us because it blurs the line between innocence and horror, between child and spectre. They did not choose their blood, but they were forced to carry it, wear it, and become symbols of it for generations to come. And so, the hollow lingers in the American psyche like a fever dream. It exists in the uneasy silence when people speak of backwoods families. It lives in the ghostly photographs that surface from forgotten archives. It lingers in the way we look at isolation, at poverty, at deformity, and choose to turn away. The hollow is not just a place, it is a warning, a reminder that what we abandon does not simply disappear. It festers, it twists, and one day it comes back, not as myth, but as truth too disturbing to ignore. In the end, the forgotten hollow teaches us something darker than any superstition. It shows us what happens when humanity is left to wither unseen, when children are born into silence instead of opportunity, when bloodlines circle back upon themselves until they become cages. It asks us to look at the faces we'd rather not see, and to admit that they are not ghosts, but reflections. Because the most haunting truth is this: the children of the hollow were never monsters. They were us, stripped of choice, stripped of help, and left to become the living record of a nation's deepest neglect.